In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about multi-samples, and then in the next video, we're going to make our own multi-sampled instrument and talk about them just a little bit. So in this video, what we have are 4 different pianos. We have a synthesized piano, we have a grand piano light that I have edited for just one sample. We have a grand piano light that has some multi-samples, and then we have our actual grand piano, okay? And we're going to just kind of walk through each of these instruments and talk about them, talk about how they go from from less detail to more detail, and why that's relevant to you as a music producer, more or less. So we're beginning with this 1986 preset, all right? I do have the 2 effects on, and I'm gonna leave them on in this case. We might turn them off just for a second, but this is going to be more of an electronic keyboard sound. It's a very popular sound. And it sounds good, okay? It's very classic. It's something that might fit your production. Like, let's say you're doing some kind of an 80s ballad, okay? You'd probably go with something that sounds a lot like this, but it is synthesized. There are no samples actually being used. So that sound, to make it sound like an electric piano, we're using synthesis methods. In this case, we're using the phase 4 to generate this sound. When we move on to our first instance of this sampler, what we have here is just a single sample. Okay, it's a single sample at D3 that has been spread all the way across our key range. And remember, we are in repitch mode, which is saying the way the pitch is going to change is going to actually either speed up or slow down playback. Now, let's see if this is D3. This is D3 right here. So this is the sample playing back at regular speed. Now, when we play up higher on the keyboard, we can see how much faster it's going through playback. Now, believe it or not, it still sounds like a piano to me. If we go down to lower octaves, it's going to play slower. And some really old sampled instruments would sometimes do stuff like this, just one sample to keep the file size really small, to keep the memory down, and you would be playing this across different octaves, and to be honest with you, it doesn't sound that bad. Now, moving on, if we want a little bit more realism, we're gonna go to the grand piano light. And now with the grand piano light, what I'm looking at and when I'm seeing this, it's telling me there are as many samples as I see zones. Now, that's not always gonna be true because you can group samples, so you may not always see it like this, but when I bring this up, I can see that this is my number of samples. And again, when I'm playing, because we're in repitch mode, if I'm back to that D3 position, this D3 is actually covering a few different keys. So let's see if I can find D3. Okay, so at D3, at D sharp, at D flat, and then at C, it actually is going to a different range. So C sharp, we're getting that D3 key range, D, D sharp, and then E moves over to F. So essentially we have 3 keys that are all being played back by that one sample. And you can see based on the playback, one starts to drag a little bit, one's going through faster, one's lagging a little bit. Okay, but for every key, it's a very small key range. So much more realistic than what we were hearing before. However, if I play a key really soft, or I hit it really hard, all that we're modulating is the volume. Okay, we're not actually triggering any different samples. So this keyboard was basically sampled with somebody just hitting the key or trying to hit it at the same level. And by default, this one does have a few effects as well. It's brought in a reverb, and it's actually tried to, using this EQ, get rid of some of the room noise. By default, the delay is not on. So if we turn off the delay and reverb, we can hear what this sounds like. And the only thing then processing the sound is the EQ. And if we take the EQ off, you can hear how it's essentially trying to actually like remove the room. That's more or less what that is doing. And it's fine with all of these off. You can still tell it is a piano, but when we bring them back on, it's going to make it a little bit more realistic. Imagining we're in a little bit of a hall here. And it's a lot of the reason why with multi-sampled instruments, people do it with a really close mic technique because they want to eliminate the room. They want you to be able to take their multi-sampled instrument and then put it in any space that you want to put it into, not be stuck with the space they were recording in. Some are really complicated and they might actually want to capture that space for you. But I think we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Let's move on to our final example, which is the grand piano. Now, with the grand piano, this is telling me, oh man, this is like, let's just look at the difference in picture. This is like 10 times as detailed as the previous one. So now when we bring this up, and let's go to our D3 spot again. Let's see if I'm playing D3, up 1 octave. Okay, let's bring this over just so we can see it a little bit better. And we're going to bring this down just a bit so we can see that there are 3 zones here. So now when I play D3, if I play this D3 and I barely tap the key, I have to do even softer. Okay, that's triggering a particular sample. And you see how this is called D301? When I go up to D302, this is now another instance of that exact same note, but this time being struck a little harder. And within each of these, there's still going to be velocity variation, so there's still going to be volume variation, but it's basically trying to simulate a little bit more what an actual grand piano would be like if you're playing with a wide dynamic range. So if you're playing quietly versus if you are slamming the key. And those are 3 different samples going for a little more realism. And in this case, every single key has been sampled, at least for those 2 higher velocity zones. And then occasionally on the lower one, they'll have it overlap for a couple of notes. Okay, which again, in all things considered, it's still going to be extremely, extremely realistic. Now, I believe this piano is roughly a gigabyte of samples. Okay, there are multi-sampled pianos on the market that are like 18, 19 gigabytes worth of samples if you really want to get super nitty-gritty, super detailed. But that always comes at a price, right? You're going to be using a little bit more of your CPU because it's having to index all of those samples for you in real time. Anyway, I just thought it would be good to introduce this idea of multi-sampled instruments by showing you this range. And the question you're asking yourself as a music producer, this is probably the most important part, is, well, what type of sound do I need based on the production I'm going for? So like I said before, if you're doing some kind of like an 80s thing, that might be the appropriate sound. If you're doing something a little more lo-fi, or, you know, this would probably be the best example of something lo-fi where you want some realism, but you're playing way out of range, or you're playing further away from the center, that might be the right sort of sound for you. That might work really well. If you're doing something a bit more detailed, and then maybe if you're scoring a film or something where it's just the piano, you're going to want as detailed a piano as possible, okay? All right, so hopefully that's helpful for you. And in the next video, we're going to go ahead and build a multi-sampled instrument from scratch.